Welcome to another edition of Trail Runner Nation. My name is Don Freeman.
And I'm Scott Warr, and we have a couple guests here today that are going to teach us a little bit about going really long. First, we have Coach Ian Sharman of Sharman Ultra Coaching. He's the head cheese at Sharman Ultra Coaching. That's why he gets the name on the business. If you don't know Ian, he is an amazing runner. Right now, he's focusing on marathons, but he's done the ultras. He's been in the top 10 at Western States 9 different times, and he's won Leadville 4 times. So he knows how to go super fast. And he brought a special guest with us today. Ian, introduce our special guest and introduce the topic of why you chose this guest.
Sounds good. Well, just to say one thing, I am back to trail running more again now. So I've had a couple of years where I did some road stuff. This year I'm back in 100-mile mode. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And I just need a little break to do something different, get excited again. But anyway, so yeah, we're introducing here Annie Hughes. So she's another of the coaches at Sharman Ultra. And the topic today is really just about 200 milers, because that's become such a big thing. And as a coach, I'm seeing many, many people now saying, well, I've done 100, what's next? So you can try and get quicker, you can try and do a harder one, you can try and do a more iconic one, but also they're really difficult to get into. So loads of people are going to 200 milers, and these things are selling out, I think, pretty much within minutes of when they come out, like a year before the race happens. So Annie is a 200-mile specialist, which is why we brought her on in 2022. She's won the Moab 240 and the Cocodona 250, getting course records in both of them. And she's also won Leadville and many other races. And she's also earned her UESCA ultra coaching and nutrition qualifications too. So Annie knows a lot about 200 milers, and I think we'll be able to pick her brain pretty well.
Annie, thanks for joining us. We're excited to have you on this is your first time on Trail Runner Nation. You hail from Buena Vista, Colorado, and enjoying the warmer weather in Buena Vista, right?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I just moved down from Leadville. I lived there for the last 5 years, and running there through the winter months got a little tough. So I moved down to Buena Vista.
So, Annie, how did you happen to come across the 200? What pushed you that direction when there's other races like 5Ks and 10Ks that are a little bit easier?
Yeah, well, I grew up running cross country and track, starting in middle school and then all through high school, and then for a year and a half in college. And I moved to Colorado for my senior year of high school from Wisconsin. And so I didn't really know much about trail running when I lived in Wisconsin, but moving out to Colorado, I just got exposed to the trails and, heard about races like Leadville 100. And it definitely sparked my interest because I always liked the longer distances, like kind of the longer the better for me. And, I'd always do a little bit more mileage than the coach prescribed and that kind of thing. So I always just liked to run long and like to do higher volume. And I started climbing some of the 14ers in Colorado and just became kind of fascinated with mountaineering and that kind of thing. And so I decided to try an ultra kind of in conjunction with climbing the Colorado 14ers. And that led me to quit the cross country team. And I went from
Annie, how old were you? Is this like 18 or something? Or when was this?
Yeah, I was, I think 19. And I quit the cross country team and went from racing a 5K to a 55K right away. And I still have never run a marathon. So I just went straight to the ultra. And then it just kind of was like a snowball effect where, I did 55K and I was like, oh, that was fun. Maybe I'll try a 50 miler. And oh, that was fun. Maybe I'll try a 100 miler. And then I became interested in the 200. So
tell us a little bit about that progression. And I'm really curious about going from 5K to 55K. When the gun went off at the 55K, did you go out at the same speed as the 5K?
No, not at all. I was kind of burned out on competing and like I wasn't trying to win or anything. So I just went out really easy and made friends and yeah, I just had a really fun time out there. And I just liked the challenge of running further than I ever did before. So I didn't really start taking it seriously until I got sponsored, basically. And then I started to kind of try to compete more. And yeah.
So Ian, you've coached a lot of runners. How does a person know if 200 is in their wheelhouse? Is there a specific body type or a mindset, or if someone says, I'm thinking about running 200, do you take a look at them and kind of assess and say, yeah, I think you're perfect for it, or that's going to be a stretch? What do you see?
I'd say a lot of it is like 100 milers, which is just gain enough experience first. So Annie jumped in at the deep end a little bit more than I did. I did my first marathon in 2005, and I waited 5 years before I did a 100 miler. And during that time, I did a couple of 50 milers. I did some trail 50Ks, and I think I did 100K, which was a couple of months before my first 100 miler, just because that would be the longest run of my life. I kind of like helping people do things more gradually so they gain the experience. There's more chance of them knowing what they're doing. It's still going to be difficult. If you go from 100K to 100 miles or 100 miles to 200 miles, that is a big leap forward. So I like to generally do it more gradually. But I'd say there's two types of ultra runner. There's the ones who jump in at the deep end and the ones that want to gain as much experience knowing it'll still be difficult. And Annie, I think, was more the jumping in at the deep end of the, can I finish this? Can I even do this without as much time to get there? So Annie, how long was there before your 100 miler and first 200 mile, first 100 and first 200?
Oh, I think I did my first 100. I did the 55K in February and then the 100 miler in May. So yeah, I guess. Yeah.
When you start saying months, I was like, oh, I thought you were going to say years at least.
Yeah. Annie, did you have any advisors, any trail running friends that said, that's not how you do it?
No, actually it's the opposite. I think I had like some influences, or one of my friends, it was actually during COVID, and because I was going to run the Leadville 100 that year, and he was like, oh, Leadville got canceled, and so he was doing this race that they were still able to hold, like even through the pandemic. And he's like, all these spots opened up since people can't like travel out to the race. Like, would you want to do it? And this was a month before the race, so I just kind of jumped in.
So the 55K and the 100 miler were the same year?
I think so, if I'm remembering right.
So 5K to 100 miles in the same year.
I wonder, because I moved to Leadville in June, so maybe I think I did 250 milers that year actually, and then the 100 maybe the next year. Sorry.
That's still really quick. Really quick.
I realized I didn't actually answer the question. Anyone, if you can do running, you can do hundreds, 200s. It's just getting the time to get enough miles in, really. I mean, when I first got into it, like I said, there's 5 years between my first marathon and first 100 miler, but there was 4 years between my first marathon and my 100th marathon or ultra. So I was piling it in there. I just didn't go uber long too quickly.
So this question's for both of you. We'll start with you, Annie. You've run shorter races and you've run an extremely long race. Tell me, and this is going to come to you too, Ian, what's the toughest distance you've ever run?
Oh.
I know there's a pause, but it's actually a good question, and I think that's why she's pausing.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, the distance. First? Annie, what's the toughest distance you've ever run?
Oh, I think probably over 200 miles. This race I did in Switzerland, the Swiss Peaks 360K, had almost 90,000 feet of climbing and 230 miles. So I think that was the hardest just because, that distance in itself is really challenging. But when you can't like move through it, because it just took forever to go like 4 miles. So it just, the difficulty of the course paired with that distance was really challenging.
How about you, Ian?
So I haven't done 200 miler yet. The longest I've done is a 24-hour race. But I actually find kind of like 5Ks to be probably the most intimidating. Probably the most intimidating thing for me is a VK, because that's a 5K, but purely uphill at gradients that are my weakest link, because you need to kind of run that to do it well. And I can't run that. But for kind of a unique event that I did that I found the personally hardest would be the Grand Slam. So Grand Slam of ultra running in the US is 400 milers in a 10-week period. So by doing the fourth one of those, you've had an entire summer of just getting not just physically tired, but it's the mental fatigue of having to push yourself so hard every time, try and race to the best of your ability. And so once I got to the last one of those, actually maybe the second one was the hardest at Vermont, but by the last of them, definitely, it's really difficult to just care because you're so exhausted. You put so much effort in for so long. So I think kind of the answer here is it depends on the circumstance. Like if you did a 100 miler this week and a 200 miler next week, that 200 miler is a lot harder than it could otherwise be. So you can make races a lot more difficult or a lot easier on yourself depending on the situation.
Yeah, I think of the long ultra push is a death by 1,000 cuts, and the 5K is a death by a guillotine. It's just either way you die. One's just a little longer, but there's certain death at the end.
So if you don't know, let me set up a kind of paint the canvas with one color real quick. There's two of us on this podcast that have not run 200 miles. That's Ian and myself. And then we have Dawn and Annie who have run multiple 200s or longer. And this juxtaposition we're going to be in here, I think, is going to be a good conversation. Now, Ian has spoken with Annie about her experience and has come up with a list. And coincidentally, Dawn came up with a list for one of our listeners that asked a question about a week or two ago about her. She was planning on doing her first 200 and said, do you have any tips? So it's surprising how both of those lists actually mesh together and overlap one another. So what we're going to do for the rest of the episode is go through this list of things that are specific to a 200 miler that can help you if you're considering training for a 200 miler. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good to me.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, let's start with the first thing. And Ian, I should say, did a really good job of researching this, talking to Annie and some of the other coaches at Sharman Ultra Coaching. And the first one that he came up with was practice eating real food during long runs. So, a 200 miler, I don't know if it's possible. Annie and Don, you can both answer this question. Can you get through a 200 miler with an electrolyte drink and some goose?
I'm going to vote no on that, Annie. You take off with this, and I'll fill in with anything that I might be able to add.
Yeah, I'm going to vote no too. I mean, I think it could be possible, but yeah, probably not.
And having coached a lot of people for these, I've never known anyone even try and do that, to be honest.
Yeah.
Is it because of the food fatigue? Do you just get tired of having the same gel go in your mouth? Or is there something to do with the nutrition part, Annie? I mean, you're a nutritionist, right? Do you need to have something that you can chew, or is there an actual nutrition component to it?
Yeah, I think there is an actual nutrition component to it. Just because, at a certain point, like you need some fats and just something more substantial than just the gels. And a lot of it is hiking, so you're able to eat more real food just because you're not, exerting at such a hard effort like you would in a shorter race.
Or bouncing around, having to slosh around.
Yeah, and you're just out there for so long. Like, some people are out there for almost 5 days, so you kind of need some real food at that point.
Yeah, and so pulling up to an aid station, it was not a table, but an aid station diner there. There could be hamburgers that somebody's grilling, quesadillas. You've got lasagna. You have all kinds of real
burritos.
Food, burritos, just things that you can carry, that are savory, that just make you happier, that are available. and like Anna said, your pace isn't exactly race pace. You do some hiking out there, cat's out of the bag. Yeah, there's a little bit of efficient traveling in the form of efficient hiking, and you can eat plenty there, and it's easy on the stomach. So that's really one of the perks, I think, of having permission to eat anything you want.
And that may be why the 200s are a little more expensive. Race fee. A lot of people complain that the 200s are more than double the price of a 100-miler, and I think it's because there's a lot more food. They're not just potato chips and M&Ms and salt and boiled potatoes. I mean, I went and helped with Don at his Bigfoot 200 race, and man, some of the aid stations were putting out like seriously good food.
So what would you guys say is the best way, starting with Annie, for practicing that? So would it be like doing long races where you're doing it, or on your training runs, or both?
Yeah, I would think both. I always recommend doing some sort of overnight race before doing a 200. So if you can get a 100-miler in before your 200-mile race, that will help a lot, and just practice eating some real food during that race. And then I like to set up I recommend this for my athletes too, setting up a little aid station in your car, and then going out and doing your run, and then stopping, eating some pizza or quesadilla or ramen or something, and then going back out and finishing. So something like that can work really well too.
Don and Annie, because you've both run this, what is your favorite food at mile 120? What is like the ideal food when you're that deep?
A pillow. I think a pillow for me. Ian.
So true. Oh, I think I have a really weird one, but I like mixing instant mashed potatoes with ramen noodles. It just kind of makes
the ramen bomb.
Mm-hmm.
The ramen bomb. Oh yeah.
It works really well, and just it goes down easy. So would not eat that any other time. But it sounds really good at mile 120.
Ian?
And something to point out here that's different to a 100-miler, because we've done podcasts where we talked about the nutrition and people having more carbs per hour, and that's what the elite people are doing in cycling and running and stuff. In a race like this, because it's lower intensity, there is more hiking. You don't have as fast a burn of carbs. So that's where this wider variety of food, not just the race foods that are pure carbs, is going to be more useful. Plus, you can digest stuff like pizza, like potato, when you're walking much more easily and with a lower heart rate than when you're running.
I think one of the things that will predispose someone to gravitating to that longer distance is, there's people have special powers. Like my feet are rock solid. I never have trouble with blisters. I never have trouble with heat. For some reason, I can run like a lizard and never get hot. And I think one of the things for 200 distance people is having an iron gut. Your gut doesn't leave you. I can eat anything. I can just keep going and process it. So I think there are things that predispose you to gravitate to that longer distance. And one of the things we talked about, well, how do you train for it? And I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. If you can have a big lunch and then go run. I mean, that's training for it, to see how much you can put in see if you can still move while you digest. So you don't necessarily have to set an aid station up at, 30 miles into your run. You can start with a full stomach and see if you can live on that and see how that food travels with you. Is that one that wants to, move the wrong direction, or is it something you can continue to process?
I actually do that for 100-milers too, partly through necessity of when to fit a run in, but partly I'll just, have dinner and have had a normal big meal and then do an easy run afterwards. And so it's good if I've had a busy day and that's the only time I could fit the running in, but it's also very much 100-miler, 200-miler practice.
So one of the things that is very unique about this distance of run is that you're going to go multiple days. So one of the things that is unique, if you're comparing a 200 from a 100, is the whole idea of sleep and experiencing sleep deprivation. Let's talk about that for a minute, Annie. In your first 200 experience, did you know, or did you go into it with a strategy on how much and how frequent you were going to sleep, and how did that pan out?
Yeah, I didn't really know fully what to expect, so I sort of planned to just sleep um when I felt that wave coming on. Uh and it hit me really hard the first night. And then the second night I felt great and didn't need to sleep at all. So
Hmm.
yeah, it was interesting. I think I'd like to have more of a strategy in the future. 'Cause it was just all so new and I just kind of wanted to see what happened. But yeah, it's interesting because I've tried to go, as long as I can without any sleep, and then it just hits so hard and you end up slowing down so much. So I think kind of forcing myself to sleep earlier on and just doing it in smaller increments, like more frequently, is a really good strategy that I want to implement in the future. But yeah, in those first few races, I was just kind of trying to, get as far as I could before I needed to sleep. So
Yeah, I had mentioned that, certain races have a requirement for certain superpowers. And I think I found my superpower was just sleeping. That's my best part of my running game is sleeping. And 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 I learned that sleeping was much like any other thing that you're juggling, whether it's electrolytes, whether it's fluid, whether it's fuel, whether it's pace, whether it's the clothes you're putting on and trying to stay warm. It's something you're juggling. And the same thing with sleep. You got to put some in before you need it. Because if you do that, you can stretch it out for a long time, just like any of these other commodities that we're talking about. That if you take 20 minutes now, you can push it off for, a few hours, and then 20 minutes again and push it off for a few hours. But if you tried to push it all the way through, you may need, 5 hours total to catch back up. So little cat naps along the way, keeping it topped off and not going deep into a real deficit is a good strategy for me.
What about, we've heard some racers that do these super short cat naps, like 5 minutes or 3 minutes or even 1 minute. Annie and Don, did you find that those are effective for you?
I had some slow blinks.
Did you fall asleep moving? And is that a good sign that you've got to have a nap now?
Annie, I think that one's going to you.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've definitely had it where I start like stumbling around and or start seeing things, and that's kind of when I know that I need to at least just rest my eyes. So I sort of use those 2 or 3 minute naps like while I'm out on the actual trail, just to kind of open my eyes. But to get some actual sleep, I'll do that at the aid station and try to plan for it as best as I can. So letting my crew know like when I plan to sleep so that they can have everything ready, and I can just crawl into the car. Have a cot ready at the aid station.
And did you sleep between aid stations as well, or really just trying to do it at the aid station?
Really just trying to get the bulk of it done at the aid station. So I never slept more than, well, in the race in Switzerland, I slept for a little bit longer. I slept 4 hours total and 104 hours. And so I just did these 45-minute naps at the aid stations. But in like a race like Cocodona, I didn't sleep more than 20 minutes at a time. So
there was a very good podcast a couple of years ago that Ultra Aspire did with some of their athletes who'd been at the Moab 240. And it had from people at the very front to kind of nearer the back. So taking 2.5 days to 5 days. So, different amounts of sleep they'd need. Mm-hmm. But the thing that surprised me that Annie's kind of mentioned there as well is having these really short naps. Like they were talking about 7 to 10 minute naps. I know for a fact that when I'm running, especially when I finish a race, I can't get sleep for hours. I'm buzzing. I've been forcing myself to keep going. So I always think that's one of the hardest things to even train for. Because I suppose if you're going at a lower intensity, your body can shut down a bit quicker than if you're finishing a race at your maximum effort and you're going to be kind of really hyped up from that. But they all seem to say that this idea, these really short naps, and they just go, okay, I'm stumbling a little bit, I'm slowing down. It's better if I just go and sleep right here by the trail. They just have to make sure they know which way to go so they don't start running backwards when they wake up. But have a very quick nap and then keep moving. And even within a couple of miles, they've made up that time because they would have been walking so slowly otherwise and kind of stumbling around. So I thought that was just a fascinating thing to do that, because I'd have assumed you'd want to have bigger gaps of sleep, a couple of hours at a time at least, to get some kind of sleep cycle. So, well, first of all, Don, then Annie. Don, did you try and do longer amounts of sleeping at a time, or do you mix and match? You just see what you feel like?
Well, at Tour de France over there in Europe, they didn't allow sleeping outside of the aid stations. They wanted to make sure they could account for you. On the races here in the U.S., it was, find a spot that looks comfortable and just pull over and take a nap. And I found that was a lot better for me because there wasn't the hustle and bustle of an aid station. I didn't listen to what's going on. I was just had some solitude. And I found some real pleasure in looking for the right spot. And as you're running through the night, and you guys have all run on trail at night, you'll go through some areas that are a little bit chilly and all of a sudden warm up. You'll look for the warm-up area. And then you look for some soft ground that isn't rocky, that looks good. And then you need to find something that isn't in direct sight of the headlights coming at you. So people say, hey, are you okay over there? Number 77, you still alive? You don't need that. So you have to find a secluded place with soft. And all of that work keeps you busy and pushes off that nap a little bit. So there's a strategy to searching for the perfect spot. So,
and I want to say, I know Don has told me this before, and I'm surprised he hasn't said anything. Ian, you mentioned when you're doing these small trail naps, you need to make sure that when you wake up, you're going in the right direction. I think Don came up with the idea that he takes these trekking poles and points them in the direction that he needs to go, so that when he wakes up, he knows, oh, I need to go that way.
So you could really mess with people if you run past someone sleeping, if you turned it around.
That's why I like it. You're up front, Ian. I don't have to worry about someone like you doing that because I'm in the back.
I would never do that.
Good.
So how do you train for it? I mean, what are some great ways to know before you run one of these races how to deal with sleep deprivation?
And you want to take a shot at that, or if you don't, you can pass it over here. I'll stall for you.
Oh yeah. I think it's a tricky balance because you don't, I think it's an important thing to train for, but if you do it too often, it hinders your recovery and like just your overall training. So that's why I think, doing 100-miler before the 200, just so you get at least one night of sleep deprivation, and then maybe doing a night run during a training block, a couple night runs, just to kind of get that feeling. But it's tricky to get that.
There was a really interesting thing when I was hosting a podcast a few years ago for Podium Runner magazine. I interviewed a doctor who does a lot of sports science investigation stuff, a guy called Dr. Samuele Marcora from Italy. And he was doing research into, can you improve your ability to be sleep deprived? And so I asked him a question that I thought I know the answer to. I said, can you actually train to be better at sleep deprivation? I can get how you can train to maybe get to sleep quicker or know what works best for you. But I'd have assumed that if you're just not sleeping, or you go for runs in the middle of the night the whole time and you get less sleep, that doesn't make you better at sleep deprivation. It makes you just tired and get crappy training. But he said, no, you can actually improve it. And an example he gave was, say, doctors doing 100-hour weeks in the hospital who are getting very little sleep. That actually can help them in their ultramarathons. I mean, it doesn't help them get the training in for the ultramarathons, but for the sleep deprivation bit, that there is some evidence that actually improves it. So it's a real trade-off there, because do you want to give a bit of fitness because you have poor quality training if you do too much sleep deprivation, or do you want to improve this really key factor in the race? So kind of like Annie said, you've got to do a little bit of it. You've got to at least get an idea of what it feels like. Like with most things in the race, you don't want to be having something totally new on race day.
And there's a lot of variability between different runners that may only require a small amount of sleep, and that's their superpower, just being able to continue on. And then you may be a person that needs more. So there's so much variety in that. You just can't say, well, this is the recipe and this is what they did, so that's what I'm going to do. It's very individual. Do you find that true, Annie? Do you feel that there's some differences in runners that you're out there with in the nap cycle?
Oh, I think so, for sure. Yeah. So I think it's really something you have to experiment with and figure out what works best for you, because what works for one person might not work for another person. So,
you brought up a good point there, Don. And my question is it better to race or run a 200 miler as a tortoise or a hare? And I was going to say tortoise and hare, and you're going to go, of course it's the tortoise. This is a long race. But let me say this. Let me reframe the question. Is it better to run a 200 miler as a tortoise or a slower tortoise? Meaning taking short naps and continuing at a steady pace, or getting to a sleep station, taking a 3 or 4 hour really good nap, and you wake up and you can be faster.
I'm going to take a first stab at it and then I'll leave it to the experts, and I'll just throw this out there with the risk of being wrong.
You're the expert, Freeman. Oh. I already said that you were a 200-mile expert.
Okay. So well, you said
you can't pass that off.
Okay. Well, I'll give keeping the cup full, just very important. It takes a while to dig yourself out of a hole, and there's a cost of pace. There's a cost of your attention span, of your mind working needs to be strong to be able to see the trail, to feel your feet, to be able to make decisions. All of that takes energy, and you need to be performing at a certain level. So you need that sleep to operate at your highest level. And we all vary. So that might mean a 10-minute nap. That might be you're better with an hour, and it would be a parallel universe. So we could put two people at the start line and give them their orders, sleeping orders. It would be interesting.
So your answer is depends.
Yeah, that's right. Depends.
He knows that's always the right answer.
Yes, it is. That's usually Ian's answer.
Annie, what do you think? For you specifically, do you do better at a race where you can get short, more frequent sleeps, or infrequent, longer sleeps?
I've never tried the infrequent, longer sleeps. So yeah, I'd be interested to see how that works. But I've always just kind of gone as long as I can before I just hit a wall, and then I only let myself sleep a shorter amount. So I don't know. I'm really curious to see if I just let myself sleep a little bit more, my performance will improve. Because just in this last race I did, there were two women behind me, and they caught up to me at an aid station, and they both taken 45-minute naps, and I hadn't slept at all yet. And I was planning to sleep at that aid station. So they came in while I was there, and I watched them leave, and I had to go sleep. So it just made me wonder, maybe if I'd taken a nap earlier, I could have been with them, or maybe they wouldn't have caught me. Yeah, just who knows. So yeah, I definitely want to experiment with that. And I'm doing a couple 200s this year, so I'm excited to try some different strategies. But I think that's a really fun aspect of this distance, is just, because in a 100-miler, no one sleeps, and it's not really a consideration. Where in a 200, it's like this added challenge, and it's kind of fun.
Well, one thing I wonder about is it possible to run it quick enough to not need to sleep? Because say UTMB, that's about a 2-hour cutoff. And you start in the evening. So most people are going to have 2 full nights where they're going to be sleep deprived. So that's not massively different to some of the shorter 200 milers, i.e. the ones that are actually 200, not 250 or so. But some of them are in kind of 50-hour plus course records. Starting in the morning, that just means you've got 2 nights. Is it possible to do that without it being detrimental? Would it be better still for them to sleep even if they're that quick? Or do you think that for the very front of the field, maybe the Courtney DeWalters doing this kind of race, can they get away with just not sleeping if they're going to do it that quickly? Or is 2 nights just too much for anyone? Annie?
Oh, I think, I'm really interested to see how it works, because I haven't done a race that's, 200 flat. It's always been a bit more. So, I think maybe doing a short nap in that time, but it seems like she can really get away with that. So I think, if you can get away with less sleep, that 2-day mark might be totally doable for some people.
Scott, before you drag us to the next topic, because I know, but before we do, I have one quick sleep story. And it was at Tour de France, and they have very nice huts there. And I pulled in there and got my gear, went to sleep, and then recognized there was a couple runners there. And then out on the trail the next day, and there was a couple of nice ladies there, and they were from some country. We didn't have a similar language, but I said to them, I think I slept with you last night. And it didn't go over very well.
That's funny.
I think she accused me of hallucinating. So there is some hallucinations.
False hope there,
Yeah.
Freeman.
Yeah.
But you were saying that in English. That wasn't you saying it in a foreign language, right?
Yeah, it was English.
Okay.
He was using a foreign accent, and that's why it was even
Yeah.
more offensive.
So funny.
What's the next one on the list, Scott?
Hey, the next one, I'm gonna preface by saying, Don has run with this person a couple times, maybe 3 times, maybe more, and I was always fascinated by what she does at aid stations. That's Mika Hughes. And I remember meeting her at the Bigfoot race, and she would come in, and she was surgical at how she took care of her feet at well, I shouldn't say every aid station, but at certain aid stations, she would take off her shoes and socks, and she had meticulously taped and lubed every toe, every foot, and she didn't want help because she knew how to do it the way that she knew worked, and she would take care of both feet, and she would probably spend 15-20 minutes untaping and retaping and just taking care of her feet. And she's done an extremely good job over the years of moving up in the ladder and winning these races. So the next topic is taking care of your feet and preventing issues before they happen. So Annie, how do you handle your feet? Do you have issues with your feet in these longer races, or what do you do to help prevent?
Yeah, I really try to stay on top of that, before the race, and then keep up with it during, just like Mika. But yeah, I always tape all of my toes with that preventative blister tape from KT tape, or KT
Yeah.
is the brand. And yeah, I wrap all my toes in that, and then put the anti-chafe lube all over my feet, and then I use toe socks so that there's a barrier between each toe. That helps a lot. And then wearing some sort of gaiter over the shoes, so like dirt and rocks don't build up in there, and that can cause blisters. And then I also like to have a wide version of the shoe I wear, and then a size. Get a size up from what I normally wear, so I can change into those. Halfway through, my feet really start to swell. So yeah, that's kind of.
Annie, quick question: what order, tape and lube? Do you lube then tape, or tape then lube?
Oh, tape then lube. Yeah.
Otherwise, the
So
you
tape
put
would
the
come
lube-
off, surely.
Oh yeah, duh. Okay. So you tape your feet and then actually put the lube on top of the tape?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Ah, interesting.
Scott,
Interesting.
I respect that comment, because as a host, sometimes you just have to put it out there. Dumb question, but it keeps the momentum going. So well done.
Well, I'm trying to learn here, like the audience, because I have blister problems. That is my super weakness. Is my feet are baby feet, and so I'm trying to learn. I think that I'm going to try doing that. Is wrapping each individual toe like a little baby in a blanket, and then putting some lube over it. I think that's a good idea. Don, you have super feet. That's one of your superpowers, right?
Well, I would like to think so, but Ian had something to share. When he has something to say, it's like
I was just going to say that one thing people don't consider, particularly for 200 miles, is you'll spend so much time hiking versus running that the way you blister is going to be different hiking versus running. So I get a lot of people who they said, oh, well, I was fine in the 100 mile where I predominantly was running, and these shoes felt great and they could go up and down mountains. But then I used the same shoes in a 200 miler. And just having, 3 days of nonstop walking, it just wore the feet down in a different way. So I think just partly practicing a lot of power hiking is important, but just knowing that the chafing spots may be a little bit different with that different movement gait. And I think that's something people realize after doing one of these, but they don't necessarily think about in advance.
I can tell you something that I did that I learned from. I started with a shoe without low stack height, what's a minimalist shoe, something small. And then my idea, the thought came to me. So what I'll do is I will get a high stack shoe. So about 75 miles in, 100 miles in, I will take these low stack and put this high stack, and it will feel wonderful. Well, in fact, it did. But what I learned through this process is, why would I wait to start with a high stack when I could get more comfort? So I starting with the high stack and staying with the high stack, and that was smarter than waiting for 100 miles when my feet were trashed and then putting that trash foot in a high stack shoe. So starting high and staying high was what I learned from that. It was a dumb move to go minimalist and then try to endure that.
That's a great point. And Annie, I want to ask you this question. Annie is a Hoka sponsored athlete. Do you use a different shoe for 200 milers versus a 100 miler or 50 miler?
I don't. So I've always used the Speed Goat for every distance. And I actually got away with wearing the same pair of Speed Goats for the whole entire 200-mile race that I did in Switzerland. So I just had the same pair for the whole race, and that worked well. And I think I might have done that at Cocodona too. So yeah, that shoe has always worked really well for me. They did change it a little bit, and now I'm kind of experimenting with some other shoes because, I don't know. Yeah, the update is quite as comfortable for me. So yeah, I'm trying to figure out.
So you stayed in the same shoe. Did you ever, do you take them off at some aid stations? Like when you're doing a longer sleep or whatever, do you take them off and just get out of your shoes for a while?
I did do that. Yeah. When I would sleep for like the longer stretch, and I usually had some sort of blister, like even with all the preventative taping and everything, I'd still end up with some blister that would need to be taken care of. So I do that and then, put the shoes back on. But I try to just not mess with them as much as possible. Like take care of things before they're a problem. But I tried to just leave them alone as much as I could. But,
and you mentioned absolutely toe socks. Don, toe socks, no toe socks?
Of course. Yes, toe socks.
Toe socks. Ian, what about you? Even on the hundreds?
I don't do toe socks, but over the years I found that I can finish a 100-miler where I'm getting wet feet all of the time with no blisters, mainly by just having a shoe that fits my foot well enough. So Ultras work well for me on the trail. I was sponsored by them for years. But I found that just not having my toes squished together by being too tight, because I have quite a wide foot, that and having the foot really well snug into the shoe, so you're not going to be hitting the front of the shoe, that made a world of difference. And I use Drymax socks, used them for years, and that the combination of shoes and socks definitely matters. But if they're even just a little bit off, maybe you get by with it in a 50-miler, maybe it's a bit of an issue in a 100-miler, and then in a 200-miler, it's a really big issue. And that's kind of the thing with all these things. If you can get away with more in a shorter race. So if you can just about get through your nutrition or with your shoes or with your backpack or other things in 100, if it's starting to become a big problem in the latter stages of the 100, you've got to fix that still for the 200. So it takes even more testing and trial and error to work out what'll work. Because as soon as something hurts, your perceived effort goes through the roof. If you're chafing, if you have big blisters, everything feels harder. So you really want to have as much practice over this because you have control over these logistical things.
Boy, you brought up chafing. I mean, that's something, handle early, handle often, whatever it is. You need to carry around that squirrel nut butter stick with you. So if something comes up, you address it at the moment. There could be hours between your next aid station, and hours, digging into that chafing problem is not fun. So you need to have some minimal medical equipment with you. One being that equipment being, squirrel's nut butter.
I'll give you a story about that. Many years ago, I was out helping crew Hal Kerner around UTMB, and he got chafing at about 26 miles in. And you only see the crew every marathon or so. So he was chafing badly pretty much the first time he saw the crew. And the next time he saw us, he asked for gauze and something else. I'm like, you need gauze? What the hell's happened down there? And he finished the race. But he death marched it in for most of it. And so, yeah, that's, you know, a guy who the year before basically had won Western States. So it can happen to anyone. But these things, once they get out of control, it doesn't matter how fit you are, fitness will not overcome these difficulties. And that's kind of the thing about 200 milers. The longer the race is, the more it comes down to your tactics, your problem solving, and less down to your fitness. And so it's not just, oh, you know, Jim Walmsley's really good at the 100, so he's definitely good at the 200. Not necessarily the case. There's all these other factors coming into it to a greater degree. I mean, I'm sure he'd be great, but still.
You know, I'm looking at the clock, and I realize that we're not even close to finishing our list. So I suggest that maybe we do a part 2 on this. But before we wrap up this episode, I want to talk about packs. In these most of these long runs, they have a required equipment list that you need to carry with you, which obviously means that you're going to be carrying a larger pack. Talk to us a little bit about that, Don, and then Annie, about what kind of pack choices you make and how do you train with these larger, heavier packs.
Well, I think you've opened it up perfect for Ian to discuss the weight vest.
I knew you were going to suggest that. Yeah.
You saw that one coming?
He started to smile, didn't he?
The second you started speaking, Don, and I was like, oh, you're looking at me. Yeah. I would like to point out, weight vests are just one tool. They're not the one and only thing. And also, weight vests, I don't recommend people run with them. I recommend you hike with them. They help you a bit with your leg strength to be better at hills, especially if you don't have them locally. Although in this situation, I think, yes, they can definitely help because you're going to be doing a lot of hiking with more weight than you normally would have. So practicing with a weight vest, you know, add on a mile here and there, walk the dog with a weight vest. One of the other things that I know we'll also talk about more on the next this part 2 of this is just getting enough time on feet. And that's a way that you can get more time on feet that is specifically helping you to either be walking and hiking with the full weight backpack or to be doing it with a weight vest that's maybe a little bit more. In fact, when I did the Marathon des Sables many years ago, and that has about a 20-pound pack that you start off with at the beginning of it, so even heavier because you've got things like your sleeping bag in there and you know, loads of heavy things plus a week's worth of food. I practiced by walking around with 50 pounds worth of weights in a backpack, walking to and from work when I was in London. And when I got to the race, the 20-pound pack felt like nothing. I was like, oh, this is way easier. Yeah, and that was mainly hiking again with that. But I think using something heavier than the pack for lots of walking can particularly help in this case. Less so with 100 milers, less so with even shorter stuff where you're going to run all of it.
You know, Ian said things you can get away with in a 50, you can't get away with in 100. And similar with this, things that you can get away with 100 with that pack may not be the one for a 200 because there are problems that happen with your pack that you never even expected could happen. I took shirts and put it in between my back and the pack because the pack would rub back and forth and I was getting chafage from this pack rubbing back and forth and very painful, enough to make you want to take a nap and stop running. That's how painful it gets. And so you need a pack that fits well, rides well. There's no compromising for the time you spend on your shoe. You need to spend the same time figuring out which pack is right for you. What do you think about that, Annie?
Oh, I completely agree. Yeah, I have all my athletes pack their pack like they will for their race and just practice doing their long runs with that. And then if they live in a more, if they don't have, you know, many hills available to them, doing some treadmill hiking with that pack can be really helpful. But yeah, just getting used to it and kind of wearing it any chance you get. Yeah, good idea.
I know that each race has its own list of required gear. Give us an idea, Annie and Don, how much weight is in a 200-mile required and unrequired stuff that you want in your pack? Are we talking 40 pounds, 20 pounds, 10 pounds?
Annie? Which means I don't know.
Yeah, I've never weighed my pack. That's a good idea. But I would guess around 20 pounds. And I know, you know, for some of the longer stretches in between, like I know Moab has a big 20-mile stretch where there's not much water in between. So they'll have you carry more water for that section, and Cocodona does the same thing. So at some points you have to carry like 4 liters of water, or at least have that capacity. So yeah, that's another thing is I have my athletes carry a bunch of water in their pack, like 4 liters of water.
And to put that in context for people, so 4 liters of water, that's 4 kilos. That's about 9 pounds just of liquids. So the difference between, running out of liquid, maybe getting close to the aid station, and as you leave the previous one, 9 extra pounds. That's heavier than backpacks are typically going to be in a 100-miler.
Right.
So that's a lot of variation. So you want to be comfortable with your full backpack of all the gear and all the food, plus 9 pounds, plus a bit more than that. So the actual race thing doesn't feel like it's the heaviest thing you've had in training.
Plus, fill your belly up out of the aid station, because that's free water that you're carrying in your stomach. So, take advantage. Don't go 100 miles, 100 yards down the trail and start drinking on that water you're carrying.
This has been a great first discussion. I'm actually really excited about it, and I'm maybe even thinking about looking on some websites about upcoming 200-mile races. Maybe, I said, Freeman, maybe. Okay. But let's promise to come back in a week or two and do a part 2 where we let's do a little cliffhanger here. We're going to talk about the mental preparations of a 200. We'll talk about how to train. How far do you run? How long do you stand on your feet? We're going to talk about specific gear that you're going to need. Hygiene stuff. Do you bring a toothbrush? Do you bring a we can talk about Don bringing his hair dryer on his. But we really appreciate Annie. Great having you on for the first time. And Ian, as always, we love having you on. You bring some insight and some science into it, and of course, a lot of experience into our discussions. But let's promise to get back and finish the list in a week or two.
Well, a 200-mile podcast should be multi-day, just by nature.
Or in this case, multi-week.
There you go. There you go. Very well done, Mr. Freeman. In the meantime, put on yourself a pair of Hokas like Annie does and go out and run.
Mas.